Hi guys. So for my project, I'm trying to look at the question of mental illness and gun control, and mainly using the ethical question, should a person with mental illness be prevented from buying a gun by government regulation? So I kind of mentioned in my outline that, it's a big topic. There's a lot of other questions that it opens up, such as, what types of mental illness should warrant some sort of government, intervention to keep them from owning a gun. If guns are the only weapons that should be restricted to these people, and if there needs to be like an official diagnosis and things like that. So it's a really big issue with a lot of ethical questions. But I'm mainly just looking at whether or not the individual freedoms of somebody being able to purchase a gun should be infringed upon for the sake of public safety. So as a specific example, there's a lot to choose from. I'm looking mostly at Adam Lanza and the Newtown Sandy Hook shootings. So there's plenty of background in the outline if you guys want to get into it a bit more, but just generally some highlights is he was only 20 at the time when he decided to commit the mass murders. He killed 20 first graders, 6 staff members at the school, as well as his mother before eventually killing himself. The Connecticut's Office of the Child Advocate put out a report not long after the shooting that kind of goes into Adam Lanza's background to try and get an understanding of why he did what he did and seeing what his mental health state was when he went into that shooting. So throughout him growing up, there were developmental delays, motor skills, communication skills that he had a hard time developing, and that kind of caused him to retreat from public life and really withdraw into himself. And so I'm looking at this as, because he withdrew, he wasn't able to see people as, independent agents with, real lives and things. It was just kind of this separation and not being able to, basically seeing people as objects. And so that gets into Kant's categorical imperative too, of not being able to see people as independent agents worthy of respect. And so one of the quotes that I kind of included here, I hope to bring into the paper as well, is the fact that he really premeditated this, and this wasn't some sort of mental snap that just, how do you prevent that kind of thing? This is something planned. This is something where an intervention really could have some kind of effect. So that's part of why I'm using Adam Lanza as an example, because this wasn't just a random mental break. This was something that really was thought out, and interventions really could have been effective. And preventing him from getting a gun really could. There's ways around, illegal activity happens regardless of what the law is, which is for later in kind of that discussion, but it's at least a good case to use to kind of open up those possibilities and answer a few questions for people. So again, I mentioned that the gun control debate is huge. You guys know that. So I've really kind of simplified the aspect of gun control debate that I'm really focusing on. So where you have the NRA and other gun advocates just advocating for no government intervention regardless of really what it is, just because it sets a precedent of regulation that may not be able to be stopped, and it's an they see it as an interference of rights and personal agency. And then on the other side of that, you have government officials who are basically taking the stance that restricting some rights, some personal freedoms, can protect everybody's right to safety and the right to live. So looking at if you want to take it into a utilitarian side, it's that some needs and some pleasures are greater than others. So saying that your right to live and your right to safety is greater than one person's right to buy a gun. And so kind of generally what's agreed upon, if you're really getting into, where the NRA started and where a lot of less extreme gun advocates are coming from, most people generally agree that only people who can responsibly use a gun should own one. And so that's kind of part of the foundation for my argument is coming from is, can people who are diagnosed as mentally ill can they responsibly use a gun? And if they can't, then does that give the government the right to restrict their access? So there's lots of different directions I can take in terms of ethical concerns. So I know this is really broad and there's a lot going on here. So if there's any feedback you guys have about, which one to focus on, or if you think that addressing this from multiple perspectives is a good idea, just, any feedback on that would be great, because I'm worried this could get a bit large. So again, the kind of main ethical question I'm looking at is, does mental illness inhibit personal agency to such an extent that people with mental illness cannot make their own ethical decisions rationally? So most of the ethical principles we're looking at assume that we are rational beings that can make these decisions for ourselves, but mental illness can inhibit that. And so if we can't make our own rational decisions, does that give somebody else, like the government, the right to intervene on our behalf? So really looking at the issue of personal agency versus public safety. So the libertarian obviously would say no, that your rights are your rights and they should never be infringed upon, and that everybody has that individual liberty regardless of their ability to make decisions. And it also takes a step further that the government stepping in terms of gun sales is their interference in a free market, which is another major issue for libertarians with open free market systems, and these kinds of things where government is preventing the buying and selling of goods, which being guns in this case. So moving into a utilitarian perspective, which is a bit more of the direction I want to lean. It's again the balancing of happiness and harm. And there's a number of different utilities for the different parties involved. So for the non-mentally ill, so for your everyday citizen, there's a few happinesses that are on the table. So physically speaking, not being killed in a mass shooting is an obvious one. Emotionally, not knowing anybody who's been killed. So moves into middle a little bit when you look at those long-term things of the mental problems that come from having a family member or a close friend murdered that way, and then also not fearing being killed in a mass shooting. So again, looking at mill, where the fact that with so many mass shootings, we're kind of in a culture and a society that fears those. So whenever you're in a public space, we approach that as a society much differently than we had before other mass shootings, where you may be more aware of somebody acting a bit strange or more aware of where your exits are, things like that. And so just living in that constant state of fear. And so for Mill, if us being able to avoid living in that culture of fear may be perhaps the greatest happiness because of just the long-term societal impacts. And so for Mill, all of those pleasures arguably would be higher than pretty much the main pleasure for a mentally ill person of just having the freedom to purchase a gun. So And then those balancing out as harms are just basically the inverse, where you could be killed in a mass shooting, you could know somebody else who was killed, or just living in that culture of fear. And then for the mentally ill, again, that harm would be having that access restricted. And so then, Mill shows up on the other side of this as well, where restricting those rights for people who are mentally ill, that itself may have long-term impacts that may outweigh some levels of happiness, where just the fact that the government can come in and restrict the rights of people just because we say that they're not fit to make their own decisions. So, he had stated in Sandel that human rights are necessary for a progressive society, and if we come in and restrict those rights, what kinds of long-term impacts could that have on how we view human rights in general? So that's kind of the main argument that I'm really thinking about going with. And then I've also touched on Kant, where the question's really raised if mentally ill people are able to honor categorical imperative 2 of seeing people as independent agents worthy of respect versus, objects that are in the way or can be taken out easily or used for some greater purpose. And so since so often mental illness involves people withdrawing, and that kind of leads people to not see people as people, and that, it turns into that objectification of people. And so that's not an aspect of every mental illness, but in many cases, that's the assumption. So that's kind of what I have so far. Again, I'm really leaning towards looking at that utilitarian perspective and really balancing out the happiness and harms, the utility and harm, using Bentham and Mill to really kind of, because the debate is so large and there are so many different sides to it. I think that would be a really interesting way to really see where people stand on what the benefits of gun control in this case are and what the problems are. So any feedback you guys can give me on that would be great. And then I will send you guys my outline as well. So happy to help. Hope this, gives you guys some things to work with. And I'll see you guys when you get back. Bye.